Okay, so today we have something really interesting. We'll be taking a look at something we are familiar with, and that is infinite scroll. We have these two components which actually share a common hook. So we'll be having the logic in a common hook, and that hook will be used by also the products page, whereby you can also get an infinite list of the products. So the core focus will be on the hook, and we will see how we can implement that. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we need to ask ourselves, what is a hook? When it comes to React, you can think of a hook as shareable logic. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the hooks, they give you the chance to extract logic from components, and the logic itself is consolidated in one place, and that place is in the hook. Then when you get to use this hook in either of those components, as we saw in our case, we have these two components. When we get to use this infinite scroll hook, it will actually add the logic in the components that we have. So the way you define a hook is simply this way. You have to prefix it with the use keyword. So all hooks, they start with use, even the inbuilt hooks. So let's start exploring how this works behind the scenes and the two technologies that we'll be using. And the technologies, they're actually built in JavaScript. Okay. All right, on expanding our infinite scroll hook, we see that it accepts parameters, it has a body of the function, and then it returns something. So these parameters, think of them as the way you call a normal function. So a React hook is just a function, but this function, it has the special ability to persist state inside it. And that, when it comes to state, we'll be utilizing these variables. The first one is whether the infinite scroll section has been triggered. And by triggering, this is what I mean. When I get to the bottom, you see this section is triggered and then data is loaded. And then the current page that we are at, right? So when we look at our data, we see we are 1, 2, 3, all the way to 20. So that is page 1 and 2, and then page 3 is loaded now, all right? And then finally, the items per page. This one has been fixed, but you can also pass it in as a parameter, okay? Now, let's talk a bit about these parameters and how they actually affect this section here, whereby we have our use effect. So the two parameters that we have here, the first one is host element, the other one is trigger element class. What this infinite scroll hook will do is that it will isolate the state for each and every view. In our case, we will have one state for users inside the user scope and another one for products inside the product scope. So the things that we are passing, in this case, the host element is the element that is hosting, the list within the users, for example, and also within the products. And then the trigger element class. What is it that we want to target? And we will see why that's important later on when it comes to detecting that trigger section, all right? And then the other part is here. This one simply tells us when the host element changes, we want this use effect to trigger. When the trigger element class changes and also when the current page changes, we want to trigger the use effect, all right? Then finally, we want to return some things. And the things that we want to return are these three. Whether the section was triggered for the infinite scroll, the current page the user is at so that we can send it to the backend, and then the items per page so that we can send them to the backend. And then this one will actually help us to set whether the trigger has been met or not. All right, so let's continue and now finally expand our use effect and see what we have. All right, on expanding, this is what we have. It seems like a complicated function, but it is not. Trust me. All right, so we start. We see that the first condition we need to check is whether we have a host element, a trigger element class, and a host element, the current value. The reason we are getting the current is because if we take a look at, for example, the page of our users, all right, we have a host element, which is a ref. And for us to get the most recent value of a ref, we need to get the dot current property, all right, of the host element. So when we get that, we actually get to assign it. This is just a object destructuring assignment where we get to assign this to a host element value. Now the most important part that connects everything are these two Okay, so let me collapse these two sections and then we can take a look at each one of them independently. So let's start with a mutation observer. What is a mutation observer? As the name suggests, it observes mutations. Mutations are changes that are happening on a target DOM element or even in the whole body of this HTML page. But for us, we will be targeting a specific section as we will see later on. Then the other thing we'll be working with is the intersection observer. Intersection means two sections actually get to overlap. And what I mean by that, if we take a look at our list here, we see that when we get to the bottom, that is when the loading is triggered. Why is that happening? It's because something that we have actually specified as our trigger element, and that trigger element, it's something that matches our trigger element class, which you actually get to set for these specific pages. So for example, in this case, it will be the last element in this list. When it's actually reached and when it's actually displayed, yeah, in a given threshold, as we will see later on, it's actually going to trigger that the intersection has happened. Okay? All right, let's continue. Okay, let's look at these two highlighted lines, all right? The first one is the definition of the mutation observer. As we can see, it will have a callback function, all right, that actually gets called whenever the mutations have occurred. So how do we start listening for mutations? We start listening for mutations by simply observing. You get to actually observe the host element, yeah, and in this case, it's a list like this list. For example, we get to observe for any mutations, whether children were added to it or not. I encourage you, go take a look at mutation observer so that you get to understand what child list is and actually what subtree is. There are so many options that are here. For example, you can see we also have subtree, we also have attributes, right? Just go and look at it and in details you'll see, but for us, we'll be just using the child list, all right? So let's expand this and see what happens when the callback is actually triggered. All right, this whole section that you see here highlighted, the for loop, it's nothing complicated. Let me collapse it. I explain it, then you can walk through it together. First of all, the whole thing that it does is that it checks, is there any child that has been added to the target element? And if it is true that a child was added, we are going to check if this child is actually a trigger element. And the trigger element, as you recall, is something that is somewhere there that overlaps and intersects with our list. So if it is actually matched, then we actually stop. We say the trigger element has been found. We don't need to continue looping. Otherwise, we continue looping. So let's expand the for loop part and just see what it does. All right, so the first thing we are checking if the mutation is of a type child list, if a child was added. The other thing we are checking in these added nodes, okay? As you see, mutations, we first of all have two loops. The first one is for the mutations because it's an array. Then in these mutations, we have added nodes. We are going to check if, if there was an added node that is actually the triggered element, because there are so many nodes that are added here. In this case, there is this node, this node, this node, this node, all these nodes. But what you're interested in is the one that's at the bottom, all right? If it's actually matched, then we break and we assign it to our trigger element target, okay? Then when we get out of this loop, the for loop, after we break here, we come into the outside loop that has our mutations. Then in the outside loop also, we say, it was found, all right? So we don't need to observe, we just disconnect, all right? Then we break. So this is how you stop observing for mutations, by simply disconnecting. Then finally, when we get out of the outer loop, we come and we say if there was actually an element that was matched, the target trigger element, we are going to now listen, yeah, for intersections between this trigger element and our parent list. And in this case, it will be between the trigger element that is here at the bottom and the parent list. All right. So that's it. And the next part we are going to actually take a look at now is how this intersection happens, how it's actually triggered. Okay, let's begin. All right. As we said, an intersection observer observes for intersection, for overlapping between two elements. And that means we need to provide both of these elements. Where are we going to do that? When we are creating our intersection observer, as you can see, it's simply a class. And the class, it will accept two parameters. The first parameter is a callback. The other one is actually the configuration whereby we are specifying the host element. You remember our host element value? And the host element is actually HTML div, as we can see here. So what will happen is that when this host element are actually overlaps or they intersect, all right, with this trigger element, that is when this callback section will be called, okay? And what other configuration are we passing here? The other configuration we are passing is the threshold. How much, okay, of this trigger element do we want to see in the host element before the callback is actually invoked? So I added a small tip here. Always remember that if you do not provide a root, yeah, the document will be assumed as a default root. So if you want to have a custom root, for example, in this case, we have a div, which is a host element, then this div, it must have an overflow and it must have a defined height. Either you set it to have height of 100% so that it will take up the available space of its parent, or you can set it to have a height that is a pixel, all right, so that it actually gets to trigger the overflow. This intersection, it must be within a place where there is an overflow. Okay, that is something to have in mind. All right, and finally, after we define our intersection observer, let's look at the callback. So what our callback will just check is it will check for whether there was an intersection. The entries that were realized whenever, like for example, in this case, we scroll, entries will be emitted, all right? Then these entries that are emitted, we get to pick the first entry and we see this entry, was it an intersecting one, all right? This will be a Boolean. If it is, then we stop observing because our goal has been met. Then we set the state for is triggered to true and we increment the current page, okay? And that's it. However, before this section can actually work, okay, we need to call observer on the trigger element, because without this line of code, nothing will work because we will not be observing anything, all right? I believe that's it on this part. So we have seen how to define the hook. We have seen how it actually works. Now let's see how to apply it in our respective components. That's the products and also the users, okay? All right, so now finally, let's take a look at our components side by side. Here we have the users page, here we have the products page. So I'll close the products page, and then using the logic that we'll explain in the users page, you can actually be able to implement the products page on your own, all right? All right. So first of all, we see our definition is defined here. We have our user, they have the age, first name is a string, gender can be male or female, and then the ID, and then the last name, and then the phone. Okay, so now the other part I want you to take note of. You remember our trigger element class, this will be the last user in the list. You see, in this case, you're just specifying this is the class that will represent the last element in our list, which will actually get to trigger that intersection. Okay, all right. So the other thing is the host element. I believe we talked about this, but let me just repeat. It's simply this list, this whole list that we have right here. Okay, then we have our hook. Okay, so you see, we don't have any logic, we just have our hook here, and then the hook is what will play now the role of handling all those intersections we are doing. All right, then we have our state here for simply the user list. Okay, and then finally we have our use effect. This use effect is actually going to rely on the trigger, yeah, is triggered from the hook that we have created. And then if the hook has triggered the intersection, we are going to fetch data, and we are just using dummy JSON from users list. And then when we fetch from dummy JSON, we are just going to set, we are going to select the ID, the first name, all these things, okay? It's up to you. You can play around with the values that you want. Then these are simple, then, and finally, the important part I want you to take a look at is this one. So here we are setting a timeout. Why are we doing that? Some users, they have the free wheel, like a mouse, like you can just scroll from the, or like that with just one scroll. We don't want to keep on scrolling like when we get to the bottom. That's why we are setting this timeout, and then that's after the timeout, we just get set triggered to back to false. We remember our set triggered function, and then we set the users list. Okay. Now, if we take a look at our UI, because it's actually the UI, all we need to do is to say this is a reference to our host element, then we style it using Tailwind, and then the other important thing is simply the list. The list that we have here is you have to actually set the key. In React, you have to specify the keys of items in a list to avoid multiple, like maybe issues when it comes to re-rendering and tracking the items in the list. Now, the part that we are seeing the loading will actually depend on whether the trigger section is on or not. And by that, what I mean is this: when you get to the end, we see loading. Okay, when you get to the end, we see loading and more data is fetched. All right. As you can see, it was so simple and actually easy to implement an infinite scroll with React. So what I want you to do is to go ahead and create a page for the products, this one, and actually you can utilize any API that you want. And let me know if you have any questions. If you get stuck, feel free to ask. And as always, remember, you stop growing when you stop learning. And whatever you learn, go further and teach others that you may grow together. Okay? Until the next one.